Hello, class. Now, I know it's kind of later in the semester, but we're getting to some interesting stuff, so I hope you'll still be paying attention. Now, as you remember, last week we talked about the interwar period and about some of the conflicts that were brewing in East Asia. This week we're going to talk about the Second World War. And today, yes, so the Second World War. So, to begin with, a civil war is starting to break out in China. As you know, as we talked about last class, you know Sun Yat-sen managed to overthrow the Qing dynasty and establish a republic. However, he did not live long enough to fully accomplish all of his goals, and after he died, some of his followers had different ideas about what course his country should take. So, on the two sides of the conflict, there were the nationalists who were led by Chiang Kai-shek, and the communists who were led by Mao Zedong. Can any of you tell me which political party Sun Yat-sen belonged to, or which side he favored? Yes?
Was he a nationalist?
Good. I'm glad one of you was paying attention. Yes, he was a nationalist. However, it's worth noting that he held several liberal ideas, and indeed he was willing to cooperate with the communists and wanted them to have a say in the country's future as well. However, Chiang Kai-shek wanted to exclude them entirely. So the two sides couldn't cooperate, and it led to an all-out civil war. Now, you'll notice that while this is going on, the warlords in China are still active. Like, not all of them were wiped out yet, or brought to heel yet. So there's still going to be an issue. So on the right is a picture of Chiang Kai-shek, and on the left is a picture of a statue of him currently standing in Taiwan. And likewise here is also Mao Zedong on the left, and a picture of him currently sitting in Beijing to this day. Now, as you can see, both of them are highly respected, both of them are respected by people in the present day, yet only one of them can really win the Civil War. So, bear that in mind. I know you're probably confused as to why they both still have supporters if one of them lost, but I will get to that next class. Now, it turns out that while China is having its internal conflicts, there are other events happening in the world. Specifically, very close by in Japan. Now, you probably remember that Japan was starting to militarize and develop ambitions of having its own empire from last class. And how during World War I they did manage to seize some area land in the Pacific for themselves. However, while they had a colonial empire of Pacific Islands, and they also had control of the Korean Peninsula, their empire was still smaller than the one the Europeans had, and they felt it wasn't fair that they had less land and prestige to their name simply because they began expanding later. So kind of like Germany in the First World War, Japan wanted to have its place in the sun. And in fact, part of this was precipitated by the fact that they weren't invited to the peace conference after the First World War. So it seems like they felt the only way that Japan would be respected is if it could have a true empire. Of course, as you probably know by now, when countries form empires, or seek to build empires, they oftentimes become increasingly militarized and begin to see their people group as intrinsically superior to others. This will inform Japan's actions during the war, and it will also lead to a feedback loop where desiring an empire leads them to believe they're superior, but at the same time this belief will lead them to conclude that they deserve an empire. The last reason Japan started empire building during this era was just opportunity. Like the World War in Europe left the European empires in Asia too distracted to defend their colonies in Indonesia and in Indochina, and China, as you know, was wrapped up in a civil war, so it seemed like these were easy pickings for Japan. So as a result, Japan invaded China. They started in the Manchurian region in northern China using a false pretext. They claimed that China had launched a small attack on one of their unit stationed nearby, and even though this was proven to have been a false flag operation, Japan still had a valid excuse to invade. So they invaded Manchuria and established a puppet state, placing a Manchurian emperor in control of that new region while still holding the actual power over it. After which after they had done that and become emboldened, Japan decided to invade the coastal regions of China, and then they attacked the capital city of Nanking. The nationalist army under Chiang Kai-shek abandoned the city, possibly realizing they weren't prepared to defend it, although this did sort of add credence to the communist faction because they could claim that the nationalists had been cowardly during this fight. But once Japan had control of the city, they wanted to, I guess, instill fear into the Chinese population, and they felt very angry that the Chinese didn't fight harder for it. As you know from previous classes, Japan's military ethos considered it shameful to surrender without a fight. So they proceeded to massacre the city over a number of weeks and months. There was a very high death count and a lot of brutality, like rape, torture, mutilations. Some of the Japanese soldiers even took pictures of these because they were sure that they were so confident in their actions that they wanted to preserve it for posterity. Yes, Michael?
Is this the rape of Nanjing?
Yes, that is the infamous rape of Nanking.
Has anything been done about it? Like today? Like have they said anything?
In the modern era, the Japanese government still does not recognize that this atrocity occurred. It is still a very sore point of contention between China and Japan in the present day. In fact, one of the controversies around it is a shrine dedicated to war veterans of Japan. Like, that includes the soldiers who committed this atrocity, and it still makes the international community, rather upset that those war criminals were not excluded from the shrine. However, one of the effects of this massacre was that while it did send a shockwave through China, it wasn't the one that the Japanese military hoped for. It actually caused the communists and nationalists in China to put their differences aside and to work together for the sake of driving out the Japanese military. Now, that alliance won't last long after the war, but for this period, it does really throw a monkey wrench into Japan's plan for invasion. This is a map of the areas of China that Japan invaded. I'm sorry, the areas of China that Japan invaded. As you can see, they hope to claim a large amount of the area and specifically targeted coastal cities in the southern region. So they already had control over Korea by this point as well. However, Japan also decided to attack the United States. By this point, Japanese-American relations had severely declined, in part because the US had passed the Japanese Exclusion Act earlier, I'm sure you remember, and also because the United States had passed laws forbidding the sale of materials to Axis powers, which was making it harder for Japan to wage its wars. And apart from that, the US already had the severe racism against the Asian populations. After this, there was the attack. So Japan, in a hope to cripple the US Navy, launched an attack on Pearl Harbor. Now, does anybody in the class know which date it is on? It's going to be on the test. December 7th, 1941. It's a very important day in US history. You should remember it. So, as a result of this, the United States, which had been content to remain officially neutral in the war, decided to launch a full invasion. So there were several major battles in the Pacific, some key ones being the Battle of Iwo Jima and the Battle of Midway, the latter of which effectively ended Japan's naval capabilities for the rest of the war. Now, by this point, Japan couldn't win the war. Its population was already smaller than that of its enemies to begin with, and it had attacked multiple countries at once, and its allies in Europe were already being defeated. So it was only a matter of time before they would fall. However, the way in which they were defeated is rather notable, and many would say infamous. That in order to, I guess, put the final nail in the coffin for Japan's willingness to wage war, the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs upon the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This is a picture of an atomic bomb detonating. Under it is a famous quote by Dr. Oppenheimer, who helped the United States develop the atomic bombs. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." So even while the bomb was being developed, there was the people working on it already knew just how devastating it would be, and that it would be much different than anything before. Although there were worse effects that make it different than other bombs. It irradiated the soil into 2 regions, meaning that people who survived would oftentimes become sick with radiation poisoning later in their lives, or their children would be born with birth defects. So, by the end of the war, Japan surrendered due to a number of factors. And as a result, they had to concede to a number of demands by the United States. So, one of these demands was that Japan had to release control of many of its colonies, pretty much all of its islands outside of the main Japanese archipelago, and notably Korea. As you'll remember, the Korean people had been agitating for their independence ever since Japan claimed control over them, with a number of Koreans immigrants in the United States all pushing heavily for this. So this would seem like a happy time for them, but it was rather bittersweet because Korea wouldn't be fully independent yet but would still be occupied by the United States and by other powers. Because they were not because the US didn't trust them to govern themselves yet. But apart from this, the US also occupied Japan in order to rebuild it and to make sure it actually reforms its society. And also the United States went after some Japanese officials and tried them for war crimes. One famous Japanese official, Hojo, was actually executed for his role in the Pearl Harbor attack. However, the war crime tribunals in Japan were much less extensive than the ones in Europe, and a large number of Japanese war criminals simply got away with their crimes, including most of those who were involved in the Nanking massacre. Japan had a limitation set on how much money it could spend on its military and on what it could do with its military. However, the emperor was not required to step down, nor was the office of the emperor abolished, nor would Japan be divided in the way that Korea was. So in some ways Japan got, certainly not unscathed, but Japan did manage to survive this war. So during the rebuilding process, General MacArthur was the man in charge of the US occupation, and he used economic programs in order to help Japan rebuild its infrastructure and its economy after the ruins. And he also helped draft a new constitution to, I guess, make the country more democratic. Notably, this new constitution gave a lot of new rights to women who previously didn't have very many in Japan. I'm sure you remember from last class that that during the Chinese Revolution they had attempted to increase the rights of women to an extent as well. So it does show that there are social changes accompanying these political ones. So now then, does anybody have any questions? Yes, Michael, you look like you want to ask something.
Yes. What time period, does this rebuilding happen, right after the war, or the United States?
It begins right after the war, however, it continues for years after the fact. It is a rather slow rebuilding process before the occupation officially ends. Yes, Chris?
As far as the demilitarizing of Japan goes, how did Shintoism play into that?
Well, Shintoism, part of that was that the emperor had to admit that he was not divine, that he still claimed to be the descendant of the kami, but he had to admit that he himself was a mortal human. And additionally, Shintoism had been used during the war to strengthen Japan's, hold on to populace, but that had to be downplayed as well. And certainly religious freedoms were increased after this fact. So, I have a question for the class now. As you noticed a few slides earlier, the United States used the atomic bombs as a way to finish the war. There is still a lot of debate there was a lot of debate back then as to whether or not it was necessary or justified, and even to this day there is still debate as to it. So, what do you think, class? Somebody else, please.
No.
I don't mean to discourage you, but I'd like to hear what the other students. Yes?
I think it was the right decision because we needed to, well, I guess we, meaning the United States, needed to assert our military superiority over not only Japan, but showing other nations, like in particular the Soviet Union, that we should not be messed with. And using the atomic bomb is just, I guess, a precursor of what the United States technological advancements could do.
Yes, Jonah?
It's hard because I feel like we could have showed that dominance better than wiping out civilians and using that as a political message, women and children, and then the consequences for years after. And I think it possibly launches in a more difficult situation where it made the Soviet Union reactionary toward things and help speed up the conflicts between the two countries.
Yes, thirdly, as you will see next week, nuclear weapons do play a major role in the Cold War. I'll simply say that this is the last time atomic weapons were used against the civilian population, and hopefully atomic bombs will never be used again. So that's the class. Remember to do your homework, and hopefully you'll have your reading reflections done next week.